What's up, ladies and gentlemen? This is JRPG here, and today I'm gonna be reviewing a cult classic JRPG game from PS1, which is none other than The Legend of Dragoon. Now, before we go into the actual review of the game, I do want to focus on a bit of the emulation options first. So this review and the footage that you will be seeing is based on the DuckStation and the RetroArch emulators. You can make the game actually look pretty good with DuckStation because it allows you to increase resolution above 4K, and this makes a lot of the backgrounds and certain models look a lot better, but it doesn't exactly bring a one-to-one fix to a lot of the character models, which are kind of low polygon in the first place. There's also a bunch of quality of life mods which you might want to take a look at. For example, there's a rewrite of the dialogue and the menus inside the game, and this is pretty good because some of the parts of the localization, well, weren't exactly that great. And then there's stuff like item limit changer, which is a pretty good quality of life change, and make it game a bit more player friendly. And I also do want to add that there's an AI Upscale project in the making, and basically they're using AI to upscale the backgrounds of the game. They are also, upscaling the cinematics that are playing in some of the cutscenes, and it looks very, very impressive, and it reminds me quite a lot of the Moguri mod on Final Fantasy IX. I mean, it's inherently using the same techniques here, and that's probably going to be releasing in a 1 or 2 years. If you're interested, keeping up to date with that AI Upscale project, I'm gonna leave also a Discord link down below so you can maybe contribute to the project in case you're interested in. But let's now get into the actual game itself. So the game is kind of somewhat generic fantasy setting and story, but I have to admit that there are parts about the designs, for example the Dragoon armors and certain cities, that definitely give a very fresh new vibe to the expected generic fantasy look. So I think there are certain aspects and tropes which are fundamentally generic, but I think that tropes are not necessarily bad. There are tropes that are less commonly used, and there are certain tropes that certain people enjoy as well. But I fundamentally think that Legend of Dragoon really managed to do a lot of things that were fundamentally unique. It has a very good world building and, the rich history inside the events of the game, because there are a lot of games that only focus on the present, but certain games also have a lot of build up for the history, what happened before, and there's a lot of that in Legend of Dragoon, which is one of the things why I really liked about this game. And also there are a lot of designs also in characters and other things which are fundamentally a bit different looking from your generic fantasy. So maybe people saying that it's very generic is a bit of downplaying the quality of Legend of Dragoon, and also kind of add on that fact that it's a very large world which is not even like fully explored actually in the game. Opens up a lot of possibilities for potential prequel or sequel stories. Now the story starts out with our protagonist Dart, who is also a bit of a mercenary. I mean, there's a lot of correlations with Cloud from Final Fantasy VII here, and basically is about to return to his village, and he's in this forest, and he's interrupted by these soldiers. And they are kind of asking like, where are you going, and asking a bunch of questions from him, and then suddenly this dragon ambushes all of them, and then Dart starts to flee out from the forest, flee out from the dragon basically, and then manages to escape and finally makes it out back to his hometown. And turns out the town is in flames. Remember something from Cloud's storyline? And basically most of the villagers have been killed, and Dart's childhood friend Shauna has been captured by the soldiers, and now Dart is basically set out to go rescue Shauna. And this is kind of like the very premise of this story, and then it will build out into geopolitical situation in towards disc 1 and 2, disc 1 mostly, and then it is expanded upon into eventually basically saving the world. And I kind of like that, the story kind of, naturally builds up itself organically, rather than in the beginning, you are the chosen one and you have to save the world. So I kind of like this fact about Legend of Dragoon, that it's very natural and organic build up of the story. There's not really a lot of like jumping around or moving too fast or too slow. I mean, there's definitely things I would rearrange a bit and add more, context to different things if there were to be a remake to be done one day. But fundamentally, I think the pacing is pretty good. Now, when it comes to the actual story, I did enjoy it, even though it has certain generic things to it. I think there's, once again, all the characters inside the game kind of have their own form of a background story. They have their own reasons to be on the group, and they kind of have their own secrets, so to speak, and their own past. And that is kind of flushed out. Some of it maybe gets flushed out way too late inside the game, but fundamentally, I thought that all of the characters were kind of not, well written, they're not filler, and all of them kind of have a part to play in the story in a lot of ways. And maybe towards disc 4, so the game is, broken down into 4 discs, there is perhaps some, stretching out, perhaps too many dungeons, and where the story kind of moves bit too slow, and I just felt like they just wanted to add a lot of filler content here. And so in a lot of ways, I would say disc 4 has a lot of nonsensical stuff in my opinion, which could have been definitely moved out. But then again, if those last 3 dungeons were removed, maybe disc 4 would have been so short altogether. Now, in terms of something I already alluded earlier, some of the dialogue can be sometimes a bit odd. For example, in a fantasy setting, you should always use the word father, not dad. Dad is pretty bad in a fantasy setting. It's a bit of a modern word in a lot of ways, and it kind of breaks immersion. But this is a one example, and then there's some other parts of the dialogue which probably weren't translated very well. Also, perhaps some of the menus kind of had weird names on them, and the mod actually fixes a lot about that stuff. But yes, in case you're really nitpicky about dialogue in general, which I'm usually not, but you can find mods for that, which will basically change. Now let's talk about a bit of the mods. Now there are elements inside LOD that haven't aged well. I mean, most of these PS1, JRPG games have systems that are very, very outdated. But I do want to say, Final Fantasy games really have, gone through the test of time here. And most of these problems regarding LOD revolve around the base mechanics and systems. And obviously, I don't have expectation them to be aging really well, since this is actually a PS1 game. It's literally 23 years ago when this game was launched. And the item system is probably the first thing that we need to address. So the game limits to player have only 32 combat items, and by combat items I mean potions, cure, magic items, and basically this doesn't mean that you can have 99 potions. That means actually you can have 32 potions of one kind if you chooses to have arranging your inventory that way. The mod also allows you to basically have the limit of 64 items. People who don't like to work in this archaic limitation may download that mod and can have a bit more smoother gamer experience, because the game limits this a lot, because in order to loot treasure chests in the game, you have constantly discard items or use items in order to keep around that 32 item limit, because you're not using items a lot in normal battles. You're saving all the healing items and the magic items for the boss fights. And this was something that was kind of fundamentally a bad game design. The other game, like Legend Legacy, which is kind of a homage game into Legend of Dragoon, which is on Steam, they had this similar system, but instead of limiting how many items people can have, the character would just move slower instead once they would have that item limit. That would have been a great design choice, but that's kind of a Skyrim-like type of design option. But fundamentally, I didn't like this limitation. Obviously, for equipable items like trinkets and etc., there's a 264 limit. So this was not that problematic, because you would mostly sell a lot of items inside the game instead, a lot anyways, so you would never really have that item limit come to full. Now in terms of the equipment system, it's a classical 5-slot thing where there's 3 armor pieces, weapon, and a trinket. There isn't really that many armor and weapon pieces inside the game, despite it being a very long one. So mostly you're swapping out the trinket, which usually gives you a borderline broken attributes or just immunity to a certain status effect. And there are certain trinkets that you can get very, very early on in the game if you farm gold. This will basically are trinkets that you're going to be using to the very, very late game, because usually they are like percent things, like halving all damage done, or halving all physical damage done, or halving all magical damage done, or removing all damage from a certain source altogether. So there are a lot of things like that, and the trinkets are kind of powerful in a lot of ways. In terms of the menus, they are kind of clunky to navigate, and you can't exactly view your current equipment and what status effects they may have right now. That was kind of annoying, something that I witnessed throughout my playthrough. And Legend of Dragoons also kind of falls into one of these games that chosen to allocate all the gold and the X rewards fundamentally to the boss fights. And this kind of reminds me of Witcher, and there's plenty of other games as well which are kind of like anti-grinding inside the game, because you have to grind a lot in order to find it like, having some rewarding experience in terms of that minuscule XP and gold that you get per fight. So this was something that I definitely do not like in terms of JRPG game design, because you might be stuck on a boss, and in order to level up you have to kill the boss. And that doesn't make any sense whatsoever, and then you have to go grind up for an hour some trash mobs to basically get higher level. And even if you have gold, doesn't mean that there's going to be items available for you which can like significantly boost your ability to get through the bosses, unless you know what you're doing and you're made it to the city of Lohan, which basically sells a lot of these amazing items. And there's also, however, in the grinding, you can grind out these additions, and we're going to be talking about those in a second. The world map is, I like these overhead world maps, but this one is one of those where you can't actually move. So you have to go through these lines, and this will take you one location to another location. But in order to get into location Y, you have to go through the location X first. So you can't really skip a location. And there were times in the story and in the game where you had to go multiple times through multiple zones in order to get into one place, because you couldn't find like a flying route or something else. Towards the late stage of the game, you are going to be getting a flying option, which is going to be significantly helping with this problem, but it's not going to be a one-to-one fix, because it will not be able to take you to exactly to every single location inside the game. Now let's talk about a bit of the combat inside the game, which is somewhat different approach compared to a lot of the other counterparts in the era, because a lot of it's breaking down into the attack button, which allows you to basically smash buttons at the right time to perform a combo move, or as they call it in this game, addition. And these combos basically grant you SP that allows you to transform into the Dragoon form. And under the Dragoon form, you are basically able to access a higher form of attack, which does a lot more damage, and also Dragoon magic. And this Dragoon magic is very scarcely used because the MP limit is very high in the game. So I think the max limit for MP for certain characters is 100, and the smallest MP cost inside the game is 10. So basically you have only 10 uses of that magic per battle, unless you have obviously items that are going to be restoring your MP. And I guess in a lot of ways these Dragoon magics are kind of like the high-end skills, and they do feel very rewarding to use, so they're a bit stronger than the other magics inside the game, which is pretty good. But I felt like at times that the Dragoon form also doesn't allow you to use items or defense, so it's kind of like a full-on offense. And then there's obviously bosses which have like certain spells that kill you at one shot if you're in the Dragoon form. So, and also some spells which lower the Dragoon magic strength. And so it's kind of like a neat balancing system, but I always felt that with this game that it kind of lacked perhaps like that one last option of strategy inside the game. I don't know what could have been, some type of a counter attack or something else that could have added a bit more complexity to it. I mean, the additions are kind of complex, especially towards the end, because fundamentally they get lighter complex. The last additions you're going to be getting for last characters revolve around like 8-9 combos, and those are really hard to execute because the window of smashing that button is very, very small. Like we're talking about a half of a second or something, so you're going to be very careful, and it's going to be taking a bit of time to learn some of those like last combos, which was kind of annoying. I also do want to add that some of those Dragoon magic sequences, they're very long. Some of them like being 1 minute long. Luckily there is a rewind effect in Dock Station and also in the retro arc, which can make the battles go a bit faster and grinding inside the game. And that's something that I do recommend also using when you're playing this game if you do not like watching the sequences over and over again. There's also a bit of an option which allows you to basically toggle out the transformation effects, which makes the characters transform into Dragoon faster, and that's kind of like makes the animations shorter. Now finally there is the defend ability, which is done a bit differently. In most JRPG games, let's be honest, defend is never used. Probably the last JRPG game where defend was a relevant ability was Lost Odyssey, and fun fact, some of the Legend of Dragoon developers ended up eventually going to work on Lost Odyssey. That's why the two games have kind of similar combat systems. But fundamentally the defend was a very powerful ability in this game because it not only it reduced damage from magical attacks but also physical, but also healed 10% of your health. So basically in normal fights it was very recommended to basically spam defend because you wouldn't want to use your healing items because you were reserving those for the boss fights, unless you always had a town next nearby where you could go in to heal yourself up or buy more of these items. But as I said, the gold was exactly kind of scarce in the game in the first place, so you were not able to afford to just like buy a bunch of healing items at every point of the game. Now, in terms of like the overall combat, I thought it was okay. I just found that sometimes it was monotone. It could have used, one or two element there more to make it more fulsome, because without the Dragoon form, the characters were not able to do anything except addition attacks, defend, and use items, where in the items you had certain spells and magics, but there were no innate abilities like steal or other types of skills which would have been useful. So this is something that the game fundamentally lacked, in my opinion. But and also I do want to say that some of the later game additions were definitely more harder to execute than I wanted them to, and fundamentally they perhaps should have gone something like Auron on Final Fantasy X with his overdrives, where there would be a sequence of buttons that you would have to input before the time runs out. That would have been much better design. Now, in terms of the 9 playable characters inside the game, all of them luckily do have different addition combos and different Dragoon magic. Some are more having magic that is healing magic, and some have magic that does a lot of single target damage, and some have more AoE, and obviously all of the characters almost have a mix of all of these abilities. So some have more single target orientated, some are more AoE, and etc. So mostly the characters play out mostly similar outside of those combos of theirs and the Dragoon magic. And obviously they have different stats, so some characters have more health, some have more higher speed, some have higher attack, etc. But one of the problems inside the game obviously is because not all the characters are obviously introduced on disc 1. So when you change the character, you have to like go out of your way to basically grind out the additions. Now, when you actually execute the additions in a right way, they level up every 20 times. And so you would have to go, when you pick a new character, you would have to level up their additions, because in order to unlock the final addition, you have to max out all the previous ones. And this is can be a bit tiresome, because characters, for one, who are on the backbench get only proportion of the experience from the battles, and you don't get any of the additions grinded out for them. So fundamentally, if you wanted to swap out characters, mid-game, it was not really like recommended, because usually they would be under-leveled or they wouldn't have those additions leveled up. Now, let's talk about a bit of the OST inside the game, which has a lot of iconic tracks. This game's kind of fundamentally different because it had two different composers. You have a guy from New York, and then you have a Japanese composer, and both of them basically contributed, into the game's soundtrack. I haven't done an actual breakdown of who did what, but I think most of the tracks, they kind of work both together. Now, for example, the menu theme is the actual intro song on my channel, just a bit of sped up basically. And there's 10 to 12 really, really good tracks inside this game in the OST that I really enjoyed. The theme song, not so much, but I thought it was okay though. But the fundamental problem with this game, I would argue, is that there are certain tracks that play in multiple towns and in multiple dungeons. If you look at, like, let's say some flagship JRPG games, and I mean fundamentally we shouldn't always compare everything into Final Fantasy, but Final Fantasy always has different tracks for different dungeons and locations. That's what's something that, you know, makes them unique, or feel at least a lot more unique than they are. And that's was something that I wish that the Legend of Dragoon would have had a lot more zones which would have their own soundtracks, songs instead of like hearing some mediocre tracks play over and over again, because some of the dungeon tracks were not really that good. But the battle themes and the boss themes, I would argue, were like pretty decent. Now, in terms of the late game content and the side missions inside the game, there isn't really that much. There's a one side boss which you can unlock by collecting these Stardust items, which are fundamentally like something you have to like click. Press the X button on random like locations in towns and stuff, and they're like almost impossible to all find without actual guide. And this is kind of like, you know, Moon Logic level stuff, and that was kind of game design back then. You didn't have like some shining object or a chest there which would indicate that there's a treasure here. You just have to like literally click bookshelves, which wouldn't look like anything different from the rest of the background, and then there would be a Stardust item. And, you know, the ultimate boss basically is the last, harder than the last boss in the game. So if you're looking for a challenge, you definitely want to collect the 50 Stardust and try out the ultimate boss. There's also 2 micro dungeons, which are kind of like side hustles that you can do. And they offer some boss fights toward the latter parts of the game in Disc 3 and Disc 4. And they were okay, I guess, but they don't really solidify themselves as like dungeons because they were fundamentally just so short. And there isn't exactly any mini-games inside the game at all. There's a couple of them, but they don't actually have any value of doing them, like rewards or anything, which would make them incentivized to use these, mini-games. So my overall verdict is that Lot is definitely like a cult classic of sorts. It hasn't necessarily aged as well as some of the other JRPG games on PS1 like Final Fantasy 9 or 7. However, it still has a massive of a story that can last over 50 hours. So there's a lot of bang for the buck, so to speak, because it's such a long game. And, you know, there's some replayability obviously in this game, but fundamentally I do think that like it's a great game, it's a classic, it has definitely aged a lot better than 95% of the other JRPG games that we have on PS1. It still has a very fascinating story and a world which you get immersed into. And obviously everybody has a bit of a nostalgia bias. I did play the game, you know, back in, I don't know, like 2005 or something for the first time. And then I made it to Disc 3. So this was my first time basically completing the game through. Now, let's talk about a bit of the speculation on the potential remaster or remake of Legend of Dragoon. There has been a lot of rumors and fake news regarding around it, but I think it's definitely being entertained. There's some, sales data which could suggest and support the idea of remaking it, but it's a different thing about HD remaster versus like totally redoing the game. Like, I think it needs a lot more adjustments on the combat, on the item systems, and obviously saving at any point of the game you obviously want to. And just a quick tip here, use the save states on Monarch and also on DuckStation, makes the game a lot more easier for you. But and also exp item systems, those are a lot of quality of life changes are needed to be done. Not so much revolving around the story itself. I definitely felt that there were side characters which could have used a lot more love. Fundamentally, like Linus, for example, her story doesn't get really flushed out. The motives, where is she from, yada yada yada. So there were a lot of characters which didn't maybe get the full story wrap up that I was wished for, and these types of remakes and remasters definitely could bring so much more to the dialogue and depth to these side characters. I mean, Final Fantasy VII Remake is a good example of Wedge and Biggs. They get more fleshed out in the story, but then again, this game is so long So I don't know, like, would it have to be broken down to multiple games or something in order to basically justify the remake? And obviously you want to have like some additional content, side missions, side bosses and stuff like that. But I'm gonna wrap it up here. I think definitely Legend of Dragoon is a top 5, top 3 JRPG game on PS1. If you're looking to play something similar to Final Fantasy 9 and 7, this is probably the closest thing you can get. I mean, some of the backgrounds still in this game, especially with the upscaling resolution, still look pretty nice and detailed, and some of the OST tracks also have aged really well. But thanks for watching, guys. Make sure to subscribe for more awesome retro and current JRPG reviews on the channel. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.